realized we didn't have a good way to do priority management. The interface was already there, so again, people are familiar with it, so you don't have to retrain them on one thing.
Are you using it to manage something as low level as transfers? Oh, awesome. I know that one thing we're playing with is the idea of using what the heck's it called? The one that everyone was stealing files with years ago, BitTorrent. We're actually playing with BitTorrent to transfer files inside the facility. So we're not looking at it outside, but for our pipeline, we're trying to have all of the code run locally on everybody's computer. So no bit of code is ever running from the server. So then it becomes a question of how do you get it from the server to each person's computer? And what we're looking at is the idea that, well, most of that code lives across every computer in the facility. So why not use something like BitTorrent to actually share the files? So as long as you've got kind of a registry that says, well, these are the latest versions of every single tool, so that if I go onto a computer, the very first time I run a tool and it just essentially puts a blank folder structure on there, it's sort of like res. And so you've got an empty res on there, and then you hit go, and the first thing it does is it goes out and it asks for the latest tools and just what are they. It doesn't copy them, just asks what they are. And then when the artist goes and clicks what they want, it goes and requests those files. But if the server is busy or the server's down, they don't have it available to them. So what we thought is, well, hey, let's build in BitTorrent because we've got all of these other things that have the same thing. So let's pull it from all of the other computers that are nearby. And suddenly we can basically flood the bottleneck is no longer the server. The bottleneck is actually the computer that it's going into.
The other thing to consider, by files is pretty sus, right? Because a lot of what's inside these files, the guts of these files, is what we really need. And we're having to take a toll of bringing the entire file into existence to get maybe some little small byte range of it, right? So another thing, and this is also a long-winded, maybe we can get there one day, is to get off that dependency of files. There's, at the end of the day, it's just bits of data that's being consumed for rendering and all these other decisions. We just happen to be putting them in physical files at the moment. That's the place that we know how to put them in. POSIX is the familiar place that we know how to manage all this stuff. But hypothetically, it doesn't need to be there. We're talking a lot about databases, storing and managing locations of these files. We go one next and store and manage the artist's decisions ultimately that go into the computation. And so if there's some way we can get past pushing it, I'm kind of sad because eliminate while it's in a different format. It sucks for file transfer. You now just compounded everything even more. We have to send that big fat file all the way over, maybe extract one thing. So any momentum to try to get us liberated from files would be interesting. I keep looking for solutions out there that are sourcing data from databases themselves and storing artist decisions and references as opposed to physical files. But I don't know if anybody here is exploring any of that. We're starting to look at that, but I don't know if that's another thing we're crazy.
For years, I've wanted a file system that could store metadata, some type of database file system. I don't know if there's anything like that.
Yeah, fix it. That's what makes them really cool, is that they're essentially a great big metadata server that sits on top of your files. So when you're asking for information about a file, you're not asking the file, you're asking the metadata server. So, so the file is almost secondary. So you could put a crap ton of data in that database that, maybe you can pull something like an artist's decision, like the equivalent of like an EDL, right? That represents how an artist built a file into the metadata. And now when you open it up, it now recreates and rebuilds and maybe renders, because there's going to come a time when render machines are really fast, and that's not a problem anymore. So it might be cheaper to do what Adam did at Stargate, and instead of having a render file transferred around, maybe you have what rendered that file transferred around, and you just render it locally at each facility. And so that, what needs to be transferred is no longer quite as much data, so that if you've got a character with animation, you transfer the character over, you transfer the animation data over, and then you re-render it in that other facility, and now you've got it in 1/10 of the time that you would have if you had actually transferred that large animation file over.
Well, what is decompression except self-reconstructible data?
Because at Resident Fuse, we had our own render farm. I think it's maybe one of the things that kind of played into it going under. Is that, because they decided that they wanted to be Amazon and Google without having Amazon and Google's other sources of income, right? So we would package everything up to send it, and we were already doing this to send it to another site for work. We can package it all up, render it in the cloud, which is a wonderful server farm in Taiwan. Man, those computers are super fast, and so much, just like unlimited amount of data, like a space, disk space. And, you'd send it up and you'd have to wait for it to get there. And then your file frame would come back and it would be quite quick. The one thing that people talk about when they talk about transferring that people don't usually go into is you need to make sure you've got enough disk space on the other side. So, the facility has a big enough pipe to get there. When we first opened the Kuala Lumpur studio for RNH, they could have had a very fat pipe, but they didn't. They were in Cyberjaya, and I'm like, why, if we're in the computer meta area of Kuala Lumpur, why can't we have a big pipe? Because they charge a lot of money for that. And so the company's like, well, we don't have a lot of work going there, those artists aren't all trained up. So we're not going to pay for a nice big fat pipe, which meant that anything that went there was super slow.
The interesting thing is sort of take that to, if we look towards the future of, especially as people are moving towards on-demand storage and on-demand horsepower, now you're paying per minute or per byte. And so it's almost like, in the old days when we had to fit our programs on a floppy, and then the minute hard drives came along, we were like, oh, the space we want, and so we didn't have to write small programs anymore. And, we'd put them on 12 DVDs and make someone take a half an hour to install it. And then, but then it was great, and they never had to deal with it again. And then suddenly phones came along, and all of a sudden we had to write really small programs again. And so an interesting thing that I think is going to affect us is as we move towards these on-demand workflows, and especially as we're dealing with multi-facility, that's going to become the norm, is saying, okay, we don't want to transfer an entire file. We only want to transfer the part of the file that we need. At one facility I worked at, we did that where, this day this isn't that uncommon, but we used an Avere in front of Google Cloud, and so that when we rendered, we would render through the Avere so that you only transfer the part of the file, because Avere is bit level, so you only transfer the part of the file that you actually need. You don't transfer the entire file. Now, I believe Pixit transfers the entire file. It's not bit level, right? So there's another level you can take it to. But, so that idea of how do we get just the bit that we need? Because what's going to happen is right now, I don't know how much you guys, your CFOs are staring down your necks at every penny that you spend. But when we're spending pennies by the minute, they're going to be looking at us really closely and saying, okay, how come you spent another 20,000 minutes this month than you did last month, but you produced the same number of, frames, or the same number of minutes, or what was it that changed? And so what we're going to have to become good at is efficiency. And I feel like we've gotten good at the efficiency on the pipeline, on the workflow side. So meaning we went from, the reason we exist probably is because in those days when it was just a bunch of experts who knew what they were doing or were figuring it out, they didn't need us, but it was very wasteful when they started adding more people. And so they needed tools to solve those problems. And as the companies grew, companies like DreamWorks that have massive pipelines that allow hundreds of artists to do the exact same thing over and over again with little differences, become all about the pipeline. Whereas a small company can be much more specifically about the artist. So now we're looking at the same thing having to do with data, where it now becomes the whether or not we get a job might depend on our efficiency of being able to move it between a facility that's in the correct tax haven, compared to the one that we're in now.
Well, I also think, I'm double down on your, I do think everything's going, I sold my cloud data, but I do believe that you guys have heard me talk about where we're going is we are going to be in a cloud platform. We're not going to have this on-prem presence. We're not going to keep refreshing. It's really expensive. This distribution center stuff we work at, it's just not sustainable. And so what we'll need to be able to get good at is create our pipeline that is operable in the cloud, running applications out of the cloud data center. All this data movement and everything, I'm convinced it will be left to the experts at the Googles, and we will be out of that business. So our proficiency should be at figuring out how to get off that dependency on our physical devices and trying to figure out how to heavy lift from one facility to another, and instead push to a central meaning this cloud environment kind of ecosystem. Because I think that's what it's all about. Now it may not be tomorrow or the next day, but I think the economy, the egress and ingress charges that these rules that charge you, that's going to be cost per head of day one. They're going to want you to operate out of that environment, not shuttling things back and forth out of it. So I agree the Avirs help because they help reduce the churn, but I think that's ultimately right.
Yeah.
But it's off that same point, but I was wondering if anyone has actually implemented, a full pipeline in the cloud workflow, or at least you have one major facility and you're all doing super IP into that same facility to eliminate all these file transfers in the first place, which seems to be a very dominant part of our conversations, the woes of file transfer. That's the holy grail.
Yeah.
Once everybody is just logging in from either a single person in one location or 4 walled sites, all this file transfer headaches go away, with exception to potentially the final distribution of the final product to whomever, if they're not part of that same ecosystem. But the holy grail would be that it's all in one spot to start with, and we're putting the technology focus on making that easier for IP or equivalent experience as amazing as humanly possible, saving that bandwidth that was used for file transfer with your UDP, flooding your pipeline to actually try to get the best low latency KVM experience.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little because we have a client who's doing that, and I've certainly worked around a couple of others that are doing it. But we have one where they have a facility in the southeast, and they have a facility in LA, and they have a facility in the northeast. And the LA facility and the southeast facility are syncing, with sort of an old-fashioned, figure out where files need to be and get them there. But their northeast facility, which is actually larger, has all of their workstations are in the southeast facility. So, their latency, I think, is around 25 or 30, which is a little high for standard artists. But I know that I know a facility here in LA that their New York office actually works out of their LA office. So all of their servers are in LA, which creates an interesting hiring challenge, because now you have to make sure you're not hiring those artists who click faster than they think, right? Because they'll go crazy with 100 milliseconds of latency. Anybody else doing that or experimenting with it?
We're experimenting with that, and I gained confidence because I went to FMX last year, and there are several European companies that are fully operating off of 0 clients. It's like
you have one Jellyfish.
yes, I think that's one. Yeah, and they're just dead quiet. Like you go in there, and it's just you don't hear anything. There's no hum or word, and it's just. So I've seen evidence of working on Marvel movies and Star Wars movies.
How much latency is too much?
It's a good question. I don't.
That's the question.
We're actually
I'd
experimenting
say
with that
25.
now. Like PC over IP stuff, or depending on the application, you're right. There'll be different tolerances I think for different workflows.
We have a program units that we're doing, big clients.
Right. Well, in some non-cloud specifics, I mean, Sony has a history of moving to Vancouver and serving out of the LA area and throwing the display. So there's been evidence of people attempting it and succeeding. But I agree with you. I think latency is the biggest enemy of all of this.
Certain, and then you have to go back to if you end up with another facility with that latency.
For sure.
Another.
Well, and this is why I want us as a whole, as a collective, to sort of put pressure on the vendors in a sense. I mean, there are applications out there, I won't kind of into one, but they're graphically intensive, and they're not taking into consideration any sort of, having to transfer that display with peripheral input. It would be nice for the vendors to be more conscious of that and to operate better in those environments that we want to do. And I think maybe it gets better.
Exactly, and when you have to go reviews.
I'm going to bring up another thing which we haven't really talked about, which is reducing the overall footprint of data. And there was one big one that I'm aware of that I think if you did the math and calculated the savings, basically in EXR right now, the lossless compression has a bug where it tries to compress pairs of bytes, so it doesn't compress even perfectly compressible EXRs unless they happen to be repeating pairs. So like zeros,
That's in zip.
blacks will compress fully, but then if you have like a color like 1.0, some of the bytes will compress and some won't, and you get like it's half the size instead of. So a lot of times you end up with something that's effectively uncompressed.
Is
If
it
you
a
did
zip
the math
one?
on how much that is, a lot of money to save if we just make that one fix and it will be XR or like add a new. Probably the right thing to do is like add a new compression format that handles 32-bit correctly. It'd be easier than fixing the old ones.
Yeah, just quick question. Who is using zip 1 compression still? Zip 16? What else is there? PIDs? Anybody using DWA? Anybody, let's see, what else is there? What am I forgetting? There's a couple other. Anyone using one of the other ones? What are you using? Oh, okay. Anybody want to quickly say why they like DWA? All right, cool. I mean, in our testing, we found they're very small, and you know the losslessness is very minimal. Lossless. Well, there is very little loss. It looks great. That's what I'm trying to say.
The one issue we had was just pumping DWA in the FFmpeg solution. So just depending on what you're doing with it, if you're not really with the data size problem, sometimes that's more inconvenience to transfer to something else just to run through FFmpeg. That's FFmpeg's fault, or I think it's a patent thing or something. But I don't know. He didn't want to use the library version or something like that. Some legal issue.
I'm not super familiar with DWA. Does it make scam lines? So it kind of the scam line.
I thought my understanding is it was a really good way with compression, but I'm not really sure beyond that.
But not across scam lines. That upsets me.
Anybody know? Some research to do.
Yeah, for sure.
Any last thoughts and questions on this? Yeah, go ahead.
Jesse Morrow. Alan and I own a small company called Instinctual here in LA. We're often the last vendor on movies, and we just kind of get dumped on with a bunch of data. It's kind of interesting that making a movie. We just finished Men in Black last night. It comes out on the 14th.
Congratulations.
Yeah, it's crazy. But it's interesting to me that the studios aren't here treating making a movie like a multi-location pipeline problem. Because what that really is this problem, but from a macro level. And what we end up spending a lot of time on is figuring out how to fit into an existing pipeline that these studios consistently redesign on every single film. It's insane. It's totally nuts. So what would be amazing, like our biggest problem on most jobs is just figuring out how we're gonna spin up a pipeline deliverable in 6 hours and have it named right and have the mat delivered properly and have it be in the right color space. All these like fine-tuned, little details that really are the same thing on every single film. Like Pokemon, it was aces. It was the exact same process over and over again, but there's zero standards. There's no standardizing body that can help. So it would be amazing if this would probably have to come from the studios themselves that have maybe some money, or maybe these people in this room can get together to start to standardize things in a way that says, like the Mill and MPC and these companies that are, you guys are making movie shots all the time. Why does the name have to change every single time? Like, why does my little INS have to go after the comp on Men in Black, but it has to go before the comp on Pokemon? It's insanity. So, just some kind of level of that. We spend so much money. I'm sure everybody in this room spends so much money trying to accommodate these crazy things. We should try to get together and standardize this stuff.
So at SIGGRAPH, just the pitch for, I don't know if she's going to do it or not. Like SIGGRAPH out by NBC, they have a huge problem because they deal with multiple vendors in the effects space, and that data exchange, he's like, can we solve agree on a common data exchange layer? So she was considering for SIGGRAPH having for any of you guys hearing you say that's good, I guess I'll encourage her more to go do it, see who will show up.
Please.
And she wants to open source it and make it part of the Academy Foundation.
Yeah, I'll say just real quick, I know that our hosts here, and they're probably trying to kick us out, Netflix is working a little bit on this problem. Is Sam still around here somewhere? I guess he left. But he, it's one of the things he's working on, is trying to help build some standards. We're one of multiple vendors who are helping them with this problem, but the idea of how can they have some consistency between shows, but still allowing artistic freedom. Warner Brothers Features is one of our clients also, and they're looking at a similar problem of trying to standardize, and it's hard for them because the directors and supervisors want to do it their way, and so being able to come in and say, no, we want to do it, we want you to do it like this, but they're enforcing it by saying, well, we have to archive all your crap, and so we want the archive from this show, and we want the archive from Aquaman, and the archive from Superman to use the same stuff. So, there is a way of kind of pushing it from below within a studio that if you can get the asset teams on board, can help. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Eric Tsai, work over at Image Works with Houston. Getting back to your problem, I actually interviewed over at Marvel, and unfortunately, Marvel essentially should be the place to kind of like centralize this, because you would think they're working on large tentpole films, they have pretty nice budgets. Unfortunately, their pipeline department, they're stuck on what you're talking about. They're stuck on ACEs. Every single one of those pipeline people, they're basically dealing with their 20 vendors and trying to figure out ACEs. So they're not trying to do like, oh, let's try to standardize set collection, set data, or doing, ingest or output. They're dealing with ACEs, okay? So even a company as large as Disney, with like the prime content that can actually standardize everything. Because like if Marvel does it, everyone's good, right? They're still dealing with ACEs.
The committee is working on a delivery spec, so just kind of naming conventions and how to structure delivering VFX, delivering plays and delivering VFX between shows and vendors. So it's a very small part of it, but hopefully that could be helpful.
Which committee?
The VS Technology Committee.
Copy that. I was accidentally kind of like semi-looping into the same thing. So apparently, this is what I was hearing, that Universal Studios with the Entertainment Technology Center at University of Southern California has this initiative group of standards for the naming convention, etc., that will be looping in all the major, studios. So I need to do some research because I'm really curious about that. Your pain is so familiar, so.
Is that fault that?
It's, the goal is to define the standards for naming convention for all aspects and set for asset.
All right, I find it interesting to create this conversation with, because this type of conversation is exactly why we started this group. Because I used to have these conversations with my office mate, and this precise topic. Also, I wanted to mention that we need to make sure that the schools are involved, because their training people are going into making movies, and while Disney seems to be taking over every studio that exists at the moment, there are a lot of small studios starting up all the time. So it's getting the people when they're young, when they're first starting up, saying, yes, you're going to be using this convention. And then when they get there, they're like, what about this convention? And the person who's been doing it for 20 years is like, what? Oh, maybe I should go find that out if I get some time. You go do it and just take care of it when you're done. So it's got to be more than just a conversation in the industry. It's got to be in the schools as well.
Frank, can we get that on the topic for the pipeline convention?
I don't know, maybe we can put it as a topic for the conference. Plug for the conference, July 28th. I mentioned, I forgot to mention earlier, there's a pipeline off, the Birds of a Feather, which happens at SIGGRAPH. It's going to be in the JW Marriott. It's going to be Monday evening from 5 to 7 p.m. And you'll see it's posted on the LA Pipeline Meetup page already. And that event is free. So if you are really broke, if you're really broke and really want to come to the conference, talk to us. But I want to thank you all for coming tonight. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. There's still plenty of food and drink, so please, have some more food. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thanks to all.